The sound of gravel crunching under tires was the last I heard of my son's presence. No goodbye, no promise to call, just the mechanical whir of his BMW backing out of the circular drive, leaving me standing on the porch of a house I hadn't seen in 15 years. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I adjusted the collar of my dress, the one I'd worn to Marlon's funeral 3 months ago, and watched the red taillights disappear through the oak trees. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was absolute, suffocating in the way that only true isolation can be. "You'll be happier here, Mom," Christian had said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone he'd perfected since becoming a successful real estate developer. "The city is too much for you now. All that noise, all those memories. As if 43 years of marriage were something to be discarded like old furniture. I turned toward the house, our house, Marlon's and mine, though it felt more like a mausoleum now. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on the east side, and several shutters hung at odd angles. The white paint had faded to the color of old bones. Marlon had always meant to fix it up, make it our retirement haven. Instead, it had become my prison. The key stuck in the lock, protesting with a metallic screech that echoed across the empty fields. Inside, dust motes danced in the late afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. The air smelled of neglect and something else, something sweet and rotting that made my stomach clench. My suitcase wheels clicked rhythmically across the hardwood floors as I made my way to what had once been our bedroom. Everything was exactly as we'd left it during our last visit. The quilt Marlon's mother had made still folded at the foot of the bed, my reading glasses on the nightstand, his work boots by the closet door. I sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, feeling the springs protest beneath me. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. Just the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant call of something wild in the approaching darkness. Christian had been thorough in his exile. No internet connection. "You never used it much anyway, Mom." No landline. Who needs a house phone these days? My cell phone showed a single bar of service that flickered in and out like a dying heartbeat. He'd even taken my car keys, claiming my Honda needed major repairs that weren't worth the cost. "I'll handle everything from the city," he'd assured me. "Sandra and I will drive out to check on you every few weeks. You just focus on resting." Resting. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. At 62, apparently, I was meant to simply fade away quietly, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. I opened my suitcase and began the mechanical process of unpacking. 3 dresses, all dark colors, as if I were still in mourning. A week's worth of underwear and sensible shoes. The prescription bottles that had multiplied since Marlon's death. Sleeping pills, anxiety medication, something for the arthritis that had begun creeping into my knuckles. As I hung my clothes in the master bedroom closet, my fingers brushed against Marlon's old jackets. They still smelled faintly of his cologne and the cherry pipe tobacco he'd favored on Sunday evenings. I buried my face in the wool of his winter coat, inhaling deeply, searching for some trace of comfort. That's when I felt it, something hard pressed against the back wall of the closet, hidden behind a row of moth-eaten garments I didn't recognize. I pushed aside the clothes and found myself staring at a stack of boxes I'd never seen before. They were labeled in Marlon's careful script, HW, personal research, and dated from the last 3 years of his life. My heart hammered as I lifted the first box. It was heavier than expected, filled with manila folders and what appeared to be scientific journals, but it was the small leather journal wedged between 2 larger notebooks that made my hands shake. Property Survey and Agricultural Assessment, H. Westfield, Private, was embossed in gold lettering on the cover. Inside, Marlon's familiar handwriting filled every page in his methodical engineer's script. Day 847. Specimen continues to show remarkable regenerative properties. Root system extends deeper than initially calculated. May need to expand cultivation area by spring. I flipped through pages of detailed drawings, pH measurements, soil compositions, and what looked like chemical formulas. Marlon had been a civil engineer, not a botanist. What was all this? Day 923. Dr. Roberts confirms preliminary findings. Compound isolation successful. Commercial applications vast. Pharmaceutical-grade extracts testing at 94% purity. Market research indicates demand exceeds 2.3 million annually for this region alone. My chest tightened. Commercial applications? Market research? Marlin had never mentioned any of this. As darkness crept across the fields outside, I continued reading by the dim light of a single bedside lamp. The entries became increasingly detailed, documenting not just the growth and properties of some kind of medicinal plant, but Marlin's careful research into patents, distribution networks, and startup costs. Day 105. Initial investment secured. Equipment delivered and stored in Southeast Barn. If something happens to me, Meryl must know. The instructions are in the envelope. She's stronger than our son realizes. She's stronger than she realizes. I set the journal down with trembling fingers. Marlin had known. Somehow, he'd known that Christian would try to sideline me, treat me like a burden instead of a partner. The thought of my husband working in secret, planning for my future while battling his own failing health, brought tears I'd been holding back for months. But the envelope he mentioned, where was it? I searched through the boxes with new urgency, scattering papers and photographs across the bedroom floor. Finally, tucked inside the back cover of the journal, I found it. A sealed manila envelope marked, "For when they forget your worth, M.W." Inside were detailed instructions in Marlin's handwriting, 3 business cards, and, my breath caught, a small stack of $100 bills. I counted them twice, $5,000 in cash. The instructions were precise, almost clinical. Meryl, you are reading this because I am gone and they have underestimated you. You always were the pragmatist in our partnership, the one who made my dreams financially viable. The plant species documented in this journal grows wild across the eastern 40 acres of our property. Dr. Elena Roberts, botanist, card enclosed, has been working with me to verify its medicinal properties. James Chen, agricultural consultant, card enclosed, knows the cultivation requirements. Patricia Williams, business attorney, card enclosed, has preliminary patent applications ready for filing. The Southeast Barn contains all necessary equipment, purchased and installed over the past 18 months. You have everything you need to build something lasting. They wanted to put you out to pasture, my dear. Instead, show them how a garden grows. I sat surrounded by the scattered remnants of my husband's secret project, holding his letter against my chest. The silence of the house no longer felt oppressive. It felt expectant, like the pause before thunder. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a sound like whispered promises. Somewhere in the darkness, Marlin's medicinal plants were growing wild, waiting for someone with the intelligence and determination to cultivate them properly. Christian had dropped me in exile, assuming I would wither away quietly. He had no idea what he'd just awakened. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Tomorrow, I would walk those eastern 40 acres. I would call Dr. Roberts from the single bar of cell service I could catch near the kitchen window. I would begin the process of transforming this prison into something Marlin and I had never dared imagine. But tonight, I would plan. Tonight, I would remember who I used to be before grief, and my son's condescension convinced me I was nothing more than a burden to be managed. The woman who had balanced Marlin's engineering firm's books for 20 years while raising 2 children. The woman who had negotiated our mortgage, managed our investments, and kept our household running like clockwork. The woman who had been sleeping, but was finally ready to wake up. I turned off the lamp and lay back against the pillows, still clutching Marlin's journal. In the darkness, I could almost hear his voice whispering the words he'd written. You're stronger than they realize. Tomorrow, I would prove him right. The first rays of dawn found me already dressed and standing at the kitchen window, holding Marlin's journal like a talisman. I'd barely slept, my mind churning through possibilities and plans that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The coffee maker gurgled to life, one of the few modern conveniences that still functioned in this forgotten place. I held my phone toward the window, watching the signal bars flicker from none to 1 and back again. At precisely 7:23 a.m., I caught a stable connection, and dialed the first number from Marlin's envelope. Dr. Roberts speaking. Her voice was crisp, professional, with a slight accent I couldn't place. I cleared my throat, suddenly uncertain how to begin. This is Merrill Westfield. I believe you knew my husband, Marlin. A pause, then softer. Mrs. Westfield. I'm so sorry for your loss. Marlin he was remarkable. I've been wondering what happened to his project. I found his journal yesterday. I need to understand what he was working on. Can you meet me today? I'm about 40 minutes from your property. There's so much I need to show you. 3 hours later, a dusty Honda Civic pulled into my driveway. Dr. Elena Roberts was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a practical ponytail and dirt under her fingernails. She carried a leather satchel and wore hiking boots that had seen serious use. Marlin never told you about any of this? She asked, shaking her head as we walked toward the eastern fields. My husband kept many things to himself. The admission stung, but it was true. Marlin had always been the dreamer, the visionary, while I managed the practical details of our life. Apparently, this was one of them. The path through the tall grass was barely visible, overgrown from months of neglect. But Elena moved with purpose, leading me toward a section of the property I hadn't explored in years. There, she said, pointing to what looked like ordinary weeds growing in scattered patches across several acres. Your husband discovered something extraordinary here. I knelt beside her as she carefully lifted a plant by its roots. The stem was unremarkable, but the root system was extensive, almost architectural in its complexity. Salvia remedialis, she said. It's not in any textbook because Marlin and I only classified it 8 months ago. It's related to common sage, but its medicinal properties are unprecedented. She opened her satchel and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid. This extract can accelerate wound healing by 40%. It reduces inflammation more effectively than most prescription medications. And the preliminary studies on its anti-aging properties. She shook her head. The pharmaceutical industry would pay millions for a reliable supply. I stared at the ordinary-looking weed in my hands. And it just grows here? Wild? Your property has a unique microclimate. The soil composition, the drainage patterns, it's perfect for this species. Marlin spent 2 years mapping the growth patterns, testing extraction methods, calculating yield projections. We spent the next hour walking the fields while Elena explained Marlin's research. He'd identified nearly 12 acres of viable growing area. The plants were hardy, requiring minimal cultivation once established. With proper processing equipment, a single acre could produce enough extract for a pharmaceutical operation worth over $200,000 annually. But why didn't he tell me? The question had been burning in my chest since I'd found the journal. Elena stopped walking and looked at me with something like pity. He said your son didn't understand your capabilities, that the family treated you like you were fragile since his diagnosis. She paused. Marlin was protecting this from anyone who might try to take it away from you. The words hit like a physical blow. Christian had started managing our finances after Marlin's first heart attack, claiming we were too emotional to make sound decisions. He'd moved our savings into accounts I couldn't access without his signature. He'd insisted on handling Marlin's estate, arguing that grief was clouding my judgment. He knew Christian would try to control me. Marlin said his son saw you as a liability rather than an asset. But Marlin remembered the woman who'd helped him build his engineering firm from nothing. He wanted to give that woman a chance to emerge again. We walked back toward the house in contemplative silence. Near the southeast barn, a structure I'd always assumed was empty, Elena stopped and pulled out a set of keys. He asked me to keep these safe, she said, unlocking the heavy wooden doors. Inside was a complete botanical processing facility. Stainless steel extraction equipment, industrial-grade drying racks, bottling machinery, and a small laboratory setup that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. Everything was covered with tarps, waiting. Marlin installed all of this himself over the past 1.5 years, Elena said. He told me he wanted you to have options, a way to be independent if you chose. I ran my hands along the smooth steel surfaces, imagining Marlin working alone in this barn while I believed he was simply tinkering with old tools. The scope of his planning was staggering. How much money would this require to get started? The initial processing can be done with what's here. You'd need to hire 2, maybe 3 local workers for cultivation and harvest. Basic operating costs would run about $8,000 a month initially. She paused. Marlon said you had business experience. I almost laughed. Business experience. For 20 years, I'd managed every aspect of Marlon's engineering firm except the actual engineering. Payroll, contracts, client relations, regulatory compliance. I'd handled it all while he focused on design and project management. But after his death, Christian had dismissed those skills as helping Dad with paperwork. I do, I said simply. Elena handed me a manila folder. These are the contacts Marlon vetted for equipment suppliers, potential distributors, and regulatory consultants. He also researched local hiring. There's a community college about 20 miles south with an agricultural program. Good source for part-time workers who understand plant cultivation. That evening, Elena stayed for dinner. We ate canned soup heated on the ancient gas stove and talked about Marlon's vision for the operation. She'd been more than a research partner. She'd been a friend who'd seen past his quiet exterior to the ambitious mind beneath. He was excited about this in a way I hadn't seen since we first opened the firm, I admitted. I thought he was just gardening to keep busy. Marlon said retirement was killing him slowly. He needed a project, something to build rather than simply maintain. Elena set down her spoon and looked at me directly. He also said you'd been fading since he got sick, that you'd started letting your son make decisions for you because grief was easier than fighting. The accuracy of her observation was uncomfortable. After Marlon's diagnosis, I had stepped back, let Christian take control, accepted his narrative that I was too emotional and fragile to manage alone. It had been simpler than asserting myself during the most difficult period of my life. What would you need from me to move forward? I asked. Partnership, Elena said without hesitation. I can handle the scientific aspects and regulatory approval, but this needs someone who understands business operations, someone who can manage growth and scaling. Marlon always said you were the business brain of your marriage. After Elena left, promising to return the following week with cultivation schedules and equipment manuals, I sat alone in the barn surrounded by Marlon's hidden legacy. The processing equipment gleamed under the fluorescent lights, waiting to transform those unassuming weeds into something valuable. I thought about Christian's phone call 3 days ago, his condescending check-in. How are you settling in, Mom? Getting plenty of rest? He'd assumed I would spend my days reading romance novels and watching soap operas until he could arrange for a care facility. Instead, I was standing in a fully equipped pharmaceutical processing facility that my dead husband had built in secret. The irony was almost beautiful. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the contacts Elena had provided. James Chen, the agricultural consultant. Patricia Williams, the business attorney. 3 other names I didn't recognize but who apparently understood the commercial potential of what grew wild in my backyard. For the first time in months, I felt something besides grief and resignation stirring in my chest. It was anticipation, sharp and electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Christian had left me in exile, expecting me to wither gracefully into irrelevance. Sandra, his wife, had smiled her plastic smile and promised they'd visit when they could find time. They had no idea what they'd just handed me. I locked the barn and walked back to the house under a canopy of stars brighter than anything visible from our old apartment in the city. The silence that had felt oppressive yesterday now hummed with possibility. Inside, I opened Marlon's journal to a fresh page and began writing my own entries. Business plans, revenue projections, hiring timelines. The practical details that would transform his botanical discovery into financial independence. My pen moved steadily across the paper, and for the first time since Marlon's funeral, I smiled. Tomorrow, I would call James Chen about soil preparation for expanded cultivation. I would contact Patricia Williams about business incorporation and patent protection. I would begin the process of becoming someone my family had never imagined I could be. Someone who didn't need their permission or approval. Someone who could build an empire from weeds while they assumed I was simply wilting away in rural obscurity. The woman Marlon had believed in all along was finally ready to prove him right. 3 weeks after finding Marlon's journal, I stood in the barn at 6 a.m. watching James Chen examine my soil samples under a portable microscope. He was a compact man in his 50s with calloused hands and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of coaxing life from difficult ground. "Your husband was right about the microclimate," he said, adjusting the focus. "The pH balance here is perfect for Salvia remedialis. We can triple your viable cultivation area with proper preparation." I made notes in my own journal, a leather-bound book I'd bought during my single trip to town the previous week. The drive had taken 40 minutes each way in the rusty pickup truck I'd found in the barn, keys hanging on a nail beside Marlon's work boots. Christian didn't know about the truck. There were many things Christian didn't know. "What's the timeline for expansion?" I asked. 6 weeks for soil preparation and planting. Another 2 months for the first mature harvest. James stood and wiped his hands on a rag. "Elena says you want to start commercial processing by fall. Earlier, if possible." He studied my face with the assessing look of someone who'd worked with ambitious landowners before. "That's aggressive. You'll need workers, equipment calibration, regulatory approval. Are you certain you want to move this fast?" I thought of Christian's last phone call 2 days ago. He'd been distracted, rushing between client meetings, treating our conversation like an item to check off his daily task list. "How's the isolation treating you, Mom? Getting enough rest?" As if rest were the only thing a 62-year-old widow was capable of. "I'm certain," I told James. Patricia Williams, the business attorney, arrived that afternoon driving a silver Mercedes that looked absurdly out of place against the rural backdrop. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with short blonde hair and a handshake that could crack walnuts. "Marlon spoke about you often," she said, settling into a kitchen chair with a briefcase full of documents. "He said you had the sharpest business mind he'd ever worked with. He was biased. Maybe. But his projections for this operation were conservative to a fault. If we execute properly, you're looking at 7-figure annual revenue within 18 months. 7 figures. The number hung in the air like smoke. Marlon and I had lived comfortably on his engineering income, but we'd never been wealthy. Christian's real estate success had made him our family's primary earner, a fact he reminded me of whenever he took control of another aspect of my life. Patricia spread papers across the kitchen table. "I've drafted incorporation documents for Westfield Botanical Solutions." Marlon suggested that name, said it honored your partnership while establishing your independence. I signed papers that afternoon until my hand cramped. Business licenses, patent applications, tax registrations, employment documentation. Each signature felt like a small act of rebellion against the narrative Christian had constructed about my capabilities. "There's one more thing," Patricia said as she packed her briefcase. "Marlon set up a trust fund before he died. $50,000 that doesn't go through probate, doesn't require your son's approval. He intended it as startup capital for this venture." I stared at her. "Christian never mentioned a trust. Because Christian doesn't know about it. Marlon was strategic about protecting your interests." She handed me a bank card and a folder of account documents. "He wanted you to have resources your family couldn't control or access." That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, the first alcohol I'd consumed since Marlon's funeral, and called Elena to report on the day's progress. The phone service had improved after I'd climbed onto the roof and adjusted the antenna, another skill I'd forgotten I possessed. "Patricia says the initial patent filing will be approved within 60 days, I told her. "James can have the first expanded cultivation ready for harvest by September. And workers? I'm interviewing candidates tomorrow." Elena laughed. "You sound different, Meryl. Stronger." I was different. The woman who had meekly accepted Christian's exile was being replaced by someone I barely recognized. Someone who made decisions quickly, who trusted her own judgment, who felt energized rather than exhausted by challenge. "Marlon knew this would happen," I said. "He hoped it would. He used to say that grief had made you forget who you were before you became his wife and Christian's mother." The next morning brought 5 job applicants, all students from the agricultural program James had recommended. I interviewed them at the kitchen table, the same place I'd signed my business documents the day before. The first 3 were fine, competent, reliable, willing to work for the wages I could offer. But Mary Stone was different. 22 years old with dirt under her fingernails and opinions about plant cultivation that impressed even James Chen. I grew up on my grandmother's farm in Mexico, she explained. Medicinal plants, herbs, traditional remedies. My family has been doing botanical cultivation for 4 generations. This is pharmaceutical-grade production, I warned. Strict protocols, precise measurements. She smiled. My grandmother always said precision was just another word for respect. You respect the plants, you respect the process, you get quality results. I hired her on the spot, along with 2 of the other candidates. We would start with a small crew and expand as the operation grew. That weekend, I drove into town for supplies and made another discovery that shifted my understanding of Marlin's planning. At the hardware store, the owner, a weathered man named Bill Tucker, greeted me by name. Mrs. Westfield, haven't seen you since Marlin was setting up that equipment delivery last spring. Equipment delivery? The processing machinery for your barn. Took 3 trips with my flatbed truck to get it all out there. He shook his head admiringly. Marlin said you folks were starting some kind of specialty farming operation. I bought what I needed and drove home slowly, processing this new information. Marlin hadn't just planned the business in secret. He'd involved the local community, established relationships, laid groundwork I was only beginning to understand. The full scope of his deception became clear the following Monday when I received a call from First National Bank. Mrs. Westfield? This is Janet Morrison, Marlin's account manager. I wanted to follow up on the business loan application he submitted before his passing. I'm sorry. What loan application? A pause. The $50,000 small business loan for Westfield Botanical Solutions. It was approved last month, but we never received the final paperwork. I sat heavily in Marlin's desk chair. Can you send me copies of everything? The documents arrived by courier that afternoon. Marlin had applied for the loan 8 months ago, listing me as the primary business operator and guaranteeing it against the property deed. His financial projections were meticulous, conservative, and compelling. The loan officer's notes praised the innovative agricultural opportunity and experienced business management team. Marlin had described our partnership in language that highlighted my contributions rather than minimizing them. According to these documents, I wasn't a grieving widow being humored with a hobby project. I was a seasoned business professional launching a promising venture. That evening, I called Elena with an update. Marlin arranged business financing I didn't know about. We have $100,000 in startup capital. He really thought of everything. He thought of things I'm still discovering. I paused, looking out at the fields where Mary and the other workers had spent the day preparing soil for expanded planting. Elena, why didn't you tell me about all this before? The loan, the community connections, the scope of his planning? Because you weren't ready to hear it. 3 weeks ago, you were still thinking like someone who needed permission to make decisions. Marlin made me promise to let you discover your own strength at your own pace. I understood. If Elena had presented me with the full extent of Marlin's preparations immediately, I would have been overwhelmed, paralyzed by the magnitude of what he'd built. Instead, each revelation had come as I developed the confidence to handle it. My phone buzzed with a text message from Christian. Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay out there? Sandra thinks we should visit soon. I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. Everything is fine, staying busy. No need to visit yet. Staying busy. The phrase felt like armor. Christian expected me to be lonely, bored, gradually declining in isolation. He had no idea I was running a business, managing employees, making decisions that would reshape our family's financial landscape. I walked out to the barn where the processing equipment waited under its protective tarps. In 6 weeks, this facility would be operational. In 3 months, I would be shipping pharmaceutical-grade botanical extracts to distributors across the region. In a year, Westfield Botanical Solutions would be profitable enough to make Christian's real estate commissions look modest by comparison. The thought made me smile. I pulled back one of the tarps and ran my hand along the steel surface of an extraction tank. Marlin had chosen this equipment carefully, researching specifications and capabilities until he found machinery that could grow with the business. He'd believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. He'd planned for my success when I could barely imagine surviving his absence. Now it was time to honor that faith by becoming the woman he'd always seen beneath the grief and uncertainty. The woman who could build an empire while her family assumed she was simply fading away. Tomorrow, Mary would begin the first large-scale planting. Patricia would file the final incorporation papers. Elena would start the process of securing pharmaceutical-grade certification for our facility. And I would continue the transformation from discarded widow to business owner, one calculated decision at a time. Christian wanted me isolated and dependent. Instead, I was becoming independent and powerful. The irony was delicious. The first harvest came in on a Tuesday morning in late September, 6 months after Christian had abandoned me to what he'd assumed would be slow decay in rural isolation. I stood in the processing facility, watching Mary and her team carefully wash and sort the Salvia remedialis roots that would become our inaugural product run. "Quality looks exceptional," Elena said, examining samples under her portable microscope. "Better than anything we achieved in Marlin's small test batches." The extraction equipment hummed with mechanical precision as we processed our first commercial batch. Each step had been rehearsed countless times over the past month. The workers moved with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed around safety protocols and quality standards I'd developed from Marlin's notes and Patricia's regulatory requirements. By Thursday, we had 48 bottles of pharmaceutical-grade extract ready for testing and certification. By the following week, Elena's laboratory contacts had confirmed what Marlin's research had promised. Our product exceeded industry purity standards by nearly 15%. "This will change everything," Elena said, holding up a vial of the clear, slightly amber liquid. "I have 3 pharmaceutical companies ready to place orders once we receive FDA approval for commercial distribution." I made notes in my business journal, calculating projected revenues and expansion timelines. The numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates put our first-year gross income at over $400,000. With proper scaling, we could reach 7-figure annual revenue within 18 months, exactly as Patricia had predicted. My phone rang as I was reviewing quarterly projections. Christian's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring 3 times before answering. I'd learned to control the timing of our conversations, to sound appropriately melancholy without revealing the energy that now drove me from dawn until well past sunset. "Hi, Christian." "Mom, finally. I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. His voice carried the familiar note of impatience barely masked as concern. "Sandra's worried about you. You sound distant lately." "I'm fine. Keeping busy with small projects around the house." "What kind of projects? You're not trying to do maintenance work yourself, are you? That place is falling apart." I looked through the kitchen window at the barn where my employees were calibrating equipment for tomorrow's production run. A delivery truck from our packaging supplier was backing up to the loading dock we'd installed last month. Mary was directing the driver with hand signals, her competence evident even from this distance. "Nothing too strenuous," I said. "A little gardening. Some organizing. That's good. That's healthy." The relief in Christian's voice was palpable. "Listen, Sandra and I have been talking. The holidays are coming up, and we think it might be better if you spend them with us in the city. You shouldn't be alone out there during the winter months." The holidays. I'd forgotten they were approaching. Last Christmas had been Marlin's final one, spent in the hospital between treatments. Christian and Sandra had visited twice, staying for precisely 45 minutes each time before rushing back to their social obligations. "I haven't thought about Christmas yet." "That's exactly what I mean. You're losing track of time, getting disconnected from normal life. It's not healthy, Mom." Normal life. I almost laughed. Christian's definition of normal life was the one where I existed as a peripheral figure to be managed and accommodated, where my contributions were minimized and my capabilities dismissed. "I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not ready for the city yet." "Mom." His tone shifted, becoming firmer. "I'm not asking. Sandra's already preparing the guest room. You can't spend Christmas alone in that isolated house. It's not safe, and it's not good for your mental health." Before I could respond, the kitchen door opened and Patricia Williams entered, carrying a briefcase and wearing the satisfied expression of someone with excellent news. She gestured for me to wrap up the call. "Christian, I need to go. Someone's at the door. Who's at the door? You don't get visitors out there. Probably just a delivery. I'll call you back later. I hung up before he could protest and turned to Patricia. She was practically glowing with excitement. FDA preliminary approval, she announced, placing a thick folder on the kitchen table. We can begin commercial distribution immediately. I also have 3 purchase orders from major pharmaceutical distributors. She spread the contracts across the table. The numbers made my breath catch. Initial orders totaling over $200,000, with options for much larger quantities pending market response. There's more, Patricia continued. I've been approached by a venture capital firm interested in scaling the operation. They're talking about a multi-million-dollar investment for regional expansion. I stared at the contracts. 6 months ago, Christian had driven me to this house like a nursing home patient being deposited for terminal care. Now I was looking at business opportunities that would make his real estate success seem modest by comparison. What would venture capital investment mean? Expansion to multiple locations. Professional management structure. You'd retain controlling ownership, but with access to resources that could make this a regional or even national operation. Patricia paused. Meryl, you're sitting on something that could become a pharmaceutical empire. That evening, after Patricia left with signed contracts that would generate our first major revenue within 30 days, I walked through the expanded cultivation fields. Mary and her crew had worked miracles over the past months, transforming scrubland into organized rows of thriving medicinal plants. Irrigation lines ran between the rows, feeding nutrients to root systems that would produce next year's dramatically expanded harvest. The barn, now officially the Westfield Botanical Solutions Processing Facility, glowed with activity lights. Our night shift was preparing tomorrow's production run, following protocols I'd developed and refined through weeks of careful experimentation. I thought about Christian's phone call, his assumption that I was losing track of time and needed rescue from isolation. He had no idea that I was working 12-hour days, managing employees, negotiating contracts, and building something that would soon surpass his own business achievements. The satisfaction was profound and slightly intoxicating. My phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. Christian told me about Christmas plans. So glad you'll be with us. The isolation must be terrible for you. I typed back, looking forward to seeing you both. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was looking forward to it, but not for the reasons they imagined. The next morning brought our first major shipment departure. I watched the delivery truck pull away carrying 40 cases of Salvia remedialis extract to pharmaceutical distributors in 3 states. Each case represented revenue that exceeded what most people earned in a month. Elena arrived as the truck disappeared down the access road. She carried a manila folder thick with new research data and business projections. I've been running calculations based on our production capacity and market demand, she said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become her regular spot during our planning sessions. If we accept the venture capital investment Patricia mentioned, we could be processing extract from over 200 acres within 18 months. And revenue? Conservative projections put annual gross revenue at $12 million by year 3. $12 million. I wrote the number in my business journal, trying to absorb its implications. Christian's most successful year in real estate had generated commissions of roughly $400,000. This operation could eclipse his entire career earnings within 3 years. There's something else, Elena continued. I've been contacted by agricultural universities interested in studying our cultivation methods. They want to document our success as a model for other medicinal plant operations. We'd be famous? You'd be famous. The widow who transformed a failed farm into a pharmaceutical empire while everyone assumed she was grieving in isolation. That afternoon, I drove to town for supplies and found myself parked outside the diner where Marlon and I had eaten lunch during our last visit to the property. Through the window, I could see the same waitress who'd served us that day, the same cracked vinyl booths, the same faded photographs of local landmarks. But everything else had changed. I wasn't the grieving widow who'd mechanically ordered soup and barely spoken during that meal. I was a business owner, an employer, a woman building something significant from resources everyone else had overlooked. I thought about calling Christian to share the news. imagining his shock when I explained what I'd accomplished during my supposed period of decline. But the timing wasn't right. He needed to discover my success on my own terms, in circumstances that would maximize the impact of his miscalculation. Christmas would provide that opportunity. I drove home as the sun set behind the processing facility, casting long shadows across fields that would soon expand to meet growing demand. The isolation Christian had intended as punishment had become the foundation of my independence. The exile meant to diminish me had instead allowed me to flourish without interference or limitation. In 10 weeks, I would sit at Christian and Sandra's Christmas dinner table. They would ask about my adjustment to rural life, expecting stories of loneliness and gradual decline. Instead, I would have news that would reframe everything they thought they understood about my capabilities and my future. The anticipation was almost as satisfying as the success itself. Almost. Christmas Eve found me standing in Christian and Sandra's marble-floored foyer, watching their faces as they processed my appearance. I'd driven myself to the city in the new Ford F-150 I'd purchased with my first major revenue check, a truck that could haul equipment and supplies for the expanding operation. My hair had been professionally styled that morning, and I wore a charcoal wool dress that emphasized the 20 pounds I'd lost through months of physical work and renewed purpose. "Mom, you look?" Christian paused, clearly struggling to reconcile my appearance with his expectations of decline and dependency. "You look really good." "Thank you." I handed Sandra the bottle of wine I'd brought, a vintage Bordeaux that had cost more than most people spent on Christmas gifts. "I thought we could celebrate." Sandra accepted the bottle with the kind of careful smile she reserved for situations that required delicate navigation. "Of course. Come in, come in. We have so much to catch up on." Their home was exactly as I remembered, professionally decorated, expensively furnished, and utterly devoid of personality. The Christmas tree dominated the living room, perfectly coordinated with silver and gold ornaments that looked like they'd been arranged by an interior designer. Over dinner, catered from an upscale restaurant because Sandra simply didn't have time to cook with her charity obligations, they peppered me with questions designed to confirm their assumptions about my deteriorating circumstances. "How are you managing the isolation?" Sandra asked, cutting her salmon into precise, identical pieces. "It must be so difficult being completely alone out there." "I'm rarely alone these days." Christian looked up sharply. "What do you mean? You're not. You haven't been letting strangers into the house, have you?" "Not strangers, exactly." I took a sip of the wine they'd opened, a bottle that cost a third of what I'd brought. "I've been working with some wonderful people." "Working?" Christian's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Mom, what kind of work?" "Agricultural consulting, small-scale farming, that sort of thing." I watched them exchange glances across the table. They were clearly concerned that grief and isolation had led me to make poor decisions, possibly financial ones that would require their intervention. "That sounds nice," Sandra said carefully. "Like a hobby, something to keep your hands busy." "It's kept me very busy." Christian set down his fork entirely. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Are you managing okay financially? Because if you're struggling, if you need help, I'm managing fine. Because I know Dad's pension and Social Security don't provide much, and if someone's been pressuring you to invest in some kind of farming scheme," I smiled. "No one's pressuring me to do anything, Christian. For the first time in months, I'm making my own decisions." After dinner, we moved to the living room where Christian produced a manila folder I recognized with dark amusement. Estate planning documents, power of attorney forms, papers that would transfer control of my finances and property to him for protection and proper management. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began, spreading the documents across the glass coffee table. "And I really think it would be better if I handled some of the business aspects of your life. The property taxes, investment decisions, that kind of thing." "Why would that be better?" "Because you're vulnerable out there. Isolated. People can take advantage of widows who don't understand modern financial realities." I leaned back against the expensive sofa cushions. "What kind of people?" "Contractors who overcharge for unnecessary work. investment advisors pushing risky schemes, anyone who sees an opportunity to exploit someone in a weakened emotional state. Someone in a weakened emotional state. The phrase hung in the air like incense, sweet and suffocating. Christian genuinely believed I was diminished by Marlon's death, incapable of making sound decisions, in need of his guidance and control. I'm not in a weakened emotional state, Christian. Mom, I know you think you're fine, but grief affects judgment. The fact that you've been working with strangers on some kind of farming project proves my point. You need protection. Sandra nodded supportively. We just want what's best for you. Family should take care of family. I opened my purse and pulled out my own manila folder. Since we're discussing family business, there are a few things I should probably mention. I spread my documents across the coffee table next to Christian's power of attorney forms, FDA approval certificates, commercial distribution contracts, bank statements showing deposits that made Christian's monthly real estate commissions look modest, incorporation papers for Westfield Botanical Solutions, projected revenue statements that reached well into 7 figures. The silence stretched for nearly a minute as they absorbed what they were seeing. What is this? Christian's voice was barely above a whisper. My farming hobby, I said calmly. It's been more successful than I initially expected. Christian picked up one of the bank statements, his face growing pale as he processed the numbers. This says you deposited $60,000 last month alone. That was a smaller month. December was much better. Sandra leaned over to examine the pharmaceutical distribution contracts. Meryl, this is millions of dollars in orders. Projected orders, I corrected, though the initial contracts are quite solid. Christian set down the bank statement with shaking hands. How is this possible? You don't know anything about business. The words hit exactly as I'd known they would. After 43 years of managing Marlon's engineering firm, after decades of balancing books and negotiating contracts and handling every aspect of business operations except the actual engineering, Christian still believed I didn't know anything about business. I know quite a bit about business, actually. I just haven't had the opportunity to demonstrate that knowledge lately. But this is... He gestured helplessly at the contracts. This is pharmaceutical distribution, international commerce. You can't possibly understand the complexities involved. I pulled out my phone and showed them the contact list I'd developed over the past 6 months. Agricultural consultants, regulatory attorneys, pharmaceutical distributors, venture capital investors, university researchers. I've learned a great deal about complexities lately. Sandra was staring at me as if I'd grown a second head. You've built a pharmaceutical company? In 6 months? While living in the middle of nowhere? Marlon left me with some excellent research and a solid foundation. I simply expanded on his work. Christian suddenly stood and began pacing behind the sofa. This doesn't make sense. Dad never mentioned any pharmaceutical research. He was an engineer. Your father was many things you never bothered to learn about. The sharpness in my voice made them both flinch. I'd maintained careful politeness throughout the evening, but Christian's dismissal of Marlon's capabilities, combined with his assumption of my incompetence, had finally penetrated my composure. Mom, Christian said, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. Even if these contracts are legitimate, you can't possibly manage an operation like this alone. You need professional guidance, proper oversight. I have professional guidance. Elena Roberts is my research partner. Patricia Williams handles legal affairs. James Chen manages cultivation. Mary Stone oversees day-to-day operations. You've hired employees? 12, currently. We'll probably expand to 25 by spring to meet increased demand. Christian stared at me with something approaching panic. The woman he'd expected to find broken and dependent was instead sitting in his living room discussing employee expansion and international pharmaceutical distribution. This is exactly what I was afraid of, he said. You've been taken advantage of. These people have convinced you to invest Dad's life insurance money in some kind of elaborate scam. I haven't touched Marlon's life insurance money. Then where did the startup capital come from? I smiled. Your father was more thorough in his planning than either of us realized. There were resources you didn't know about, opportunities he'd researched and prepared. He understood that you might not recognize my capabilities after his death. The implication hit Christian like cold water. Marlon had planned for the possibility that his son would underestimate his widow, had made preparations to ensure I could succeed independently if necessary. You're saying Dad deliberately hid assets from me? I'm saying your father understood the difference between protection and control. Sandra had been examining the venture capital proposal Patricia had prepared. Meryl, this says they want to invest $15 million in expansion. That would make you quite wealthy, yes. Christian slumped back onto the sofa, his face pale. I don't understand any of this. 6 months ago, you could barely function. You were grieving, confused, unable to make basic decisions. 6 months ago, I was allowing you to make decisions for me because I thought family loyalty required it. I've since learned the difference between family loyalty and family control. I began gathering my documents, returning them to the manila folder with the same methodical care I'd used when organizing Marlon's research notes. Where are you going? Sandra asked. Back to the property. I have a production run starting tomorrow, and I like to be there when we begin processing. Christian jumped to his feet. You can't just leave. We need to discuss this. Figure out how to protect you from whatever scheme these people are running. I stopped at the foyer closet to retrieve my coat, a wool blend that had cost more than Sandra's Christmas dress. Christian, I appreciate your concern, but I don't need protection from success. This isn't success. It's delusion. People like you don't build pharmaceutical companies. People like you. The phrase crystallized everything I'd felt but couldn't articulate during the months of Christian's increasing control over my life. In his mind, I was a certain type of person, elderly, widowed, diminished, incapable of significant achievement or independent success. You're right, I said, pulling on my coat. People like me don't usually build pharmaceutical companies. We usually let our children convince us we're too fragile to try. I walked to the door, then turned back to face them. They were standing together in the living room doorway, looking lost and frightened by the collapse of their assumptions about my limitations. I won't be available for holiday visits next year, I said calmly. Westfield Botanical Solutions is expanding into 3 additional states, and I'll be traveling frequently to oversee new facility development. But I appreciate the dinner. The cold air outside felt clean and sharp against my face as I walked to my truck. Behind me, I could hear Christian and Sandra's voices through the front door, urgent and confused as they tried to process what had just happened. I drove through the empty city streets toward the highway that would take me home to my fields, my employees, my growing empire. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m. In 9 hours, my third shift would begin processing the largest extract order in the company's history. Christian had wanted me dependent and grateful for his management. Instead, I had become independent and powerful beyond his comprehension. Marlon's voice whispered from memory, They wanted to put you out to pasture, my dear. Instead, show them how a garden grows. I smiled and pressed the accelerator, eager to return to the life I had built from exile, the empire I had grown from weeds, the future I had claimed from the ashes of their expectations. The woman they had underestimated was finally, completely, triumphantly free.